I'll take my coat off. Well, can I first of all thank you very much for inviting me to congratulate the organizers of this particular institute on having arranged a program on a subject that is so timely and yet at the same time so timeless. Because when I had the invitation to come, it took my mind back to when I first spoke in Iowa, at Iowa City at the university 44 years ago. I was a student of 22, back from the war, and we debated a motion, which I have written down, that the danger of war can best be averted by an all-purpose Anglo-American alliance. That was a discussion before NATO was formed. And I argued against it because I wasn't a Cold War warrior. And there were 573 students there, and the motion was defeated by 446 to 117, which was an indication of something. But the reason I mention it is because in 1947, America really was the dominant power in the world. Russia had lost 20 million people, Germany was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, Europe was in chaos. And if we're talking about the new world order based on a single superpower, it's worth looking back at what the position was then. Now, I'd like to begin, if I may, by examining very, very briefly the conventional wisdom about what is happening at the moment. Communism is dead, socialism has gone with it, liberal capitalism has won everywhere, America has avenged the Vietnam War. I heard from President Bush after the Gulf War was over. The Soviet Union is accepting capitalism. A new capitalist Europe is being built. Pax Americana has begun. Adam Smith has defeated Karl Marx. And Milton Friedman has defeated John Maynard Keynes. And then I hear that Francis Fukuyama, speaking this week, says history has ended. I was in Calcutta when his book came out, and you could see the hungry people on the streets cheering at the thought that history had ended and they would always be starving and always be hungry. Now, that is the conventional wisdom, and you have to address it if you're going to talk about the real world. And I suppose turning from that to what would be a new world order, if we could achieve it, it would need to provide peace, security for people, sufficiency, the protection of the planet from the challenge that exists to it, environmental and other challenges. It would have to secure human rights. It would have to provide social justice, because there is no peace possible without justice. Law and order without justice is the charter for every dictator who's ever lived. And if you then look at the opportunities and the dangers, you can get some idea of what it is that would need to be done. If you look at the opportunities, we live at the first period in human history when there is enough for everybody. If the resources of the world were properly distributed, nobody would starve, there would be homes for everybody, there would be dirt roads at least, elementary clinics and schools. And that is at least a reminder that when you talk about a proper new world order, you're not living on cloud nine. We're seeing peace talks in progress in Madrid and elsewhere. Quite a number of problems that have confronted us in recent years are being discussed. The Cold War is over. There's been some limited nuclear arms reduction. There is an enormous peace dividend to be gained if we could reallocate our resources, and there is undoubtedly a great hope worldwide for a new world order, and within it for some role for the United Nations itself. If you look at the dangers, they are, however, quite awesome too. The spread of nuclear weapons. There are a number of countries now that have found it easy to acquire nuclear weapons. The problem has been means of delivery, but elementary nuclear weapons are not hard to build. The arms race is still going on, and the arms trade, which is one of the most criminal trades in the world, is going on apace. There is a widening gap between rich and poor, both inside society, certainly inside Britain and I think the United States, and an enormous widening gap between the industrialized countries and the third world. There is a world debt crisis, which means that actually the third world is subsidizing the industrial world. Far from there being any economic aid flows, it's quite the opposite. They are being required to pay interest, which they can ill afford to pay, to the rich countries. There has been a recrudescence of nationalism, of fundamentalism. There are still appalling problems of disease. There is still the existence of imperialism. And for the industrialized countries themselves, because we are not in any way exempt from the objectives that I describe, there are the most horrific, unresolved, domestic problems in the United States, in Britain, and indeed in most industrialized countries. Problems of mass unemployment, of poverty, of ill health, of homelessness, of drugs, of crime, and anyone who thinks that somehow liberal capitalism has solved all these problems and the Russians are longing to have our drug trade, our crime rate, our homelessness, are, I think, living in a fool's paradise. And there is, of course, a huge recession. They call it before the war, before the last World War, they used to call it a slump in the Western world, which involves a massive waste of resources. If I just take the district I represent in Britain, the district of Chesterfield, we have in some wards 27% unemployment. The government have tried to avoid this by changing the basis of calculation of unemployment. I think they've changed the statistics 27 times in the 13 years they've been there, but it is still a fact that if the people who come to my weekly advice centre, which I run every week to meet my own constituents, half the people who come are unemployed and the other half come needing services that could be provided if the unemployed were at work, and that inherent contradiction is still there. But it may be more helpful, if we're looking at the future, to have a little bit of glasnost about our own past. It is a world where we live on the media headlines inclines us to forget where we came from, and I think if we do look at the past, we can make a little bit more sense of the present. My mother died last week at the age of 94, born in 1897. And the reason I mention it is that, of course, when she was born, the world was run by three white men: the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia. They had one thing in common: they were all Queen Victoria's grandsons. And nobody ever talked about human rights so long as you were being repressed by Queen Victoria's grandsons. And that was the old world order. That was the world order which somehow we believe was so terribly destroyed by the Russian Revolution. And there was massive imperialism by the European states. When I first came to America in 1947, I heard the old joke, which you may have heard, that the sun never sets on the British Empire, so some visiting British speaker said, and an American replied, that's because God doesn't trust an Englishman in the dark. But it is a fact that the world was absolutely run from these European empires. Africa was colonized, carved up by the European states, the frontiers having no regard to where people actually lived or their tribal cultures. Asia was colonized, Latin America was effectively colonized, and even when I was born in 1925, 20% of the population of the world was run from London. Now that is the background we tend to forget when we talk about what's happened in the Soviet Union. I remember as a little boy of 6 in London, I met Mr. Gandhi. He came to London for the Round Table Conference. And a British journalist asked him, when he arrived in London, what do you think of civilization in Britain, Mr. Gandhi? And Gandhi said, I think it would be a very good idea. Now, that was the world of my own childhood. But none of that is ever mentioned, as if the first breach of human rights had ever occurred, had occurred in Stalin's Russia. Then you have the First World War, which was an imperialist conflict, a trading war and a war between imperialisms, and then the Russian Revolution. Now, the Russian Revolution was without any doubt the most significant event in the 20th century, comparable to the French Revolution, more so than the American Revolution, because both the French and Russian revolutions had social implications. And from 1917 until today, the main object of the West has been to reverse it. An army was sent into Russia, British army, and I think American and certainly French troops were involved, to destroy the revolution in 1920. I came across the other day a memorandum Winston Churchill put into the British cabinet in 1920 about the forces we sent to support General Denikin, the White Russian leader, and Churchill said, whatever happens, the Ukraine must not be split from Russia, and secondly, we must tell General Denikin to stop the anti-Semitism which the White Russians were promoting, because I tell you, anti-Semitism didn't begin in Russia with the Russian Revolution. And the interwar years from 1918, 1920 to 1939 were, of course, the years when Europe swung to the right. They were the years of fascism, of Mussolini's Italy. And I'm old enough to remember some of the leaders of Western Europe in the 1930s. Field Marshal Mannerheim in Finland, no Democrat. Pilsudski in Poland, no Democrat. King Carol, King Boris, King Michael, King Zog, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Salazar, Neville Chamberlain. This is the world to which we're supposed to be returning. Indeed, when there was an election in East Germany the other day, the BBC said, in the first free elections in East Germany since 1945. So I rang them up and said, could you tell me the date on which Hitler had a free election in East Germany in 1945? But this is the mythology that has been spread. And of course, if you read Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister in 1939 and 38 at the time of Munich, which I remember very, very well, Chamberlain was accused of appeasing Hitler. He didn't appease Hitler, he supported Hitler. And if you look at the captured German Foreign Office documents, you will find that the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, was sent to see Hitler, I think, at Berchtesgaden in about 1937, and the opening of the exchange was Lord Halifax said to Hitler, I come on behalf of the British government to congratulate you, Herr Chancellor, on suppressing communism in Germany and acting as a bulwark against communism in the Soviet Union. The only capitalist country in the world that went left in the 1930s was, guess which? The United States of America. Roosevelt, although he wasn't a socialist in any more sensible definition of the term, was overwhelmingly the most progressive leader of the capitalist world in the interwar period. And the New Deal and all that followed from it, because it was very much a model for the post-war Labour government, was really a very important development in world history and played a significant part in the defeat of fascism. Then you come to the Second World War, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Now, at that time, Harry Truman, who later became president, was quoted as saying, if the Germans seem to be winning, we should support the Russians. If the Russians seem to be winning, we should support the Germans and hope that as many as possible kill each other from the other side. That was the American comment at the time that America was not in the war. And a very powerful Anglo-Soviet alliance was formed at that time. Neither Stalin nor Churchill, I must admit, for different reasons, are my favorite politicians, but they signed an Anglo-Russian treaty. And the British Conservative government issued a beautiful coloured booklet, which I have at home, called Comrades in Arms, with a picture of Churchill on one side and Stalin on the other. And that was before Pearl Harbor, before the United States came into the war at all. We knew Roosevelt was sympathetic, but he wasn't able to do much more than give us some destroyers and a lease-lend arrangement. And then, of course, you had the Pearl Harbor attack and the building up of the final stages of the anti-fascist alliance. And then the atom bombs were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war with Japan ended. I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki a few years ago, and right up to the time I went, I'm ashamed not to have known it, I thought those bombs were used to save many thousands or tens of thousands of American lives from having to land on the Japanese mainland. It wasn't until I got there I discovered that was quite untrue. The Japanese had offered to surrender some weeks before, if not months before, the atom bomb was dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why were they dropped? This all came out in the Japanese war crime trials, and I should have known it, but I didn't. You may or may not know it yourself. They were dropped as a warning by the West at the end of the war that the West had weapons of horrific strength, really as a warning to the Soviet Union. And that brings you into the Cold War. Now here, looking back over the Cold War, now it's over, I think we have a sort of obligation to re-examine the basis upon which all Western policy, including British policy, under Labour governments as well as Conservative government, because I'm not making a narrow political point there, look and see what really was the basis of it. We were told consistently that there was a Soviet military threat to Western Europe. Now, I was no supporter, and never have been, of Stalinism or the centralized communist dictatorship of the proletariat, so don't misunderstand me. But I must tell you, I never believed the Soviet Union intended to attack Western Europe. All right, they had their control of Eastern Europe. I suppose if I were to coin a phrase, they regarded Eastern Europe as their backyard. But at any rate, the idea that with all the problems that they had, lost 20 million in the war, all the destruction, that they either believed or could have defeated West Germany, France, Italy, Norway, Sweden, and Britain, and taken over Northern Ireland and dealt with Ian Paisley, I do not honestly believe that was ever true. What was true, and unquestionably true, and has been from 1917 onwards, was the fear of the spread of socialist ideas. And that really was what led to the formation of NATO, about which we had the debate in 1947 at the University of Iowa, triggered off the arms race, which is probably the arms race itself on both sides, one of the greatest crimes against humanity that has ever been committed, because the money poured into weapons by NATO and the Warsaw Pact, had it been applied to the relief of world poverty, would without any doubt have saved millions and millions and millions of lives that were thrown away because of the Cold War. And then we had, of course, the evil empire argument by President Reagan, the war by proxy that was fought around the world. And yet, having said all that, I must say this about the Soviet Union. Two things I must say. One is, anyone of my generation, and I'm 66, will never ever forget that it was the loss of Russian lives that protected Britain from occupation by Hitler. Now, I know it's a difficult thing for an American audience to understand, because you were never in the position where you were in any way threatened by a German invasion. But for my generation, it was that period between May 1941 and December the 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor occurred. It was the Russians to whom we looked to carry the weight of the Soviet attack. And the second thing I must say, too, that I think it very, very unlikely that if the Soviet Union had not existed as a world power from 1917, whether the anti-colonial movements against the European empires would ever have succeeded, because the support, psychological, in some cases political, in some cases military, that was given by the Soviet Union to the old British colonies that fought their freedom was a very formidable contribution to the liberation of those countries from the European empires to which I refer. And while I'm speaking about that, let me also look at the other side of the coin of aggression. I led a delegation to the Soviet ambassador in London to protest most vigorously against the invasion by the Soviet Union of Afghanistan. Before I went, I read my history, and I did know when I went that Britain had invaded Afghanistan 4 times in the last 100 years, but that wasn't mentioned in the British press at the time. But if you look at the Vietnam War, at the Algerian War, at the Suez War, at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, at the toppling of Allende in Chile, the invasion of Grenada, the invasion of Panama, if you look at a whole range of Western interventions in other countries, it's not so very clear to me that the West by which I mean the United States and Britain and others, were so deeply concerned with human rights as was claimed in the popular press. And of course it was out of that realization that you were dealing with two power blocks, both primarily concerned with their own economic and global interests, that you got the non-aligned movement. Originating at the Bandung Conference when Nehru went to meet Zhou Enlai, and out of that came the non-aligned movement, 101 countries, very important development, totally committed to making the United Nations an effective body, arguing for disarmament and development, and of course working through the United Nations special agencies. And I must say one word here about UNESCO, because I think one of the most disgraceful acts that the American and British governments have committed was the withdrawal from UNESCO, because UNESCO wanted to set up a new world information order so that the third world wouldn't be absolutely dominated by the media moguls who now control the international television networks and indeed own so many press outlets. Now we come to the collapse of communism itself. And I think it's very important, at least I think it's important, I don't know if I could interest you in it, that we look at what really happened in the Soviet Union. A country invaded 3 times in 28 years, Stalin undoubtedly the most horrific monster in the Soviet Union itself. But of course the Stalin terror ended in 1953, which is a long time ago. And what remained, and I visited the Soviet Union every year or two since 1960, was a terrible legacy of bureaucracy and centralization, which the Russian administration perfectly well understood themselves. I remember when I went to 1968, I think it was, to Moscow as a British minister to see their exhibition of industrial automation. And they had a huge hall with a wall about 10 times as high as this, showing how the Russian economy worked. And there was the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and little flashing lights going to Gosplan, which was the planning thing, then going to the Gosplan to the industrial enterprises, to the planning ministers, and then down to the industrial enterprises, and going back the other way again. And I said to Rudnev, who was the minister, this is a very interesting demonstration, where is the consumer in this? And he said, it's funny you should ask. He said, I asked myself, but nobody seemed very interested. And that was much more than the terror, the problem they faced. It was a problem of centralized planning on an absolutely massive scale. They were also bankrupted by the arms burden. I think that the United States and Britain have suffered enormously from the amount of money we've wasted on weapons. That's why the Japanese are doing so well, because whereas we produce missiles, they produce videos, cameras, cars, and all the lot of it. But the Russians at one stage, I think, were spending 60% of their gross national product on weapons, and in a sense, I think there was an element of strategy in the West to bankrupt them by forcing them to take the view that they needed that level of weapons. And then you had, of course, Gorbachev coming along, the peace moves, the tremendous response that produced. But the one lesson that comes out of it, to me at any rate, is that what we've learned from it is you cannot impose socialism. Not that I ever believed you could, I must add, but you can't impose it. You can't impose anything over a long period. You can't impose apartheid over a long period. We had a little argument with the Pope once, known as the Reformation. You can't impose Catholicism on people. And if there is a lesson out of it, it's a democratic lesson and not an ideological lesson about whether the socialist ideas are capable of winning public support. What is happening now, of course, in the Soviet Union, I was there again not so long ago, is that the reforms that are being so widely hailed in the West are causing the most appalling hardship. Yeltsin has announced the abolition of all price controls, which means that a lot of people are going to find themselves on the breadline. In East Germany, there is now between 30 and 50% unemployment as West Germany takes over. And this idea that what we're witnessing in the Soviet Union is the return of democracy, I don't think is necessarily true at all. Indeed, the further the Russians are pushed towards capitalism, since they have no infrastructure of chartered accountants and lawyers and the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which has replaced the Ten Commandments, as far as I can understand it, as the basis of Western society, the only type of capitalism they will be able to have will be military capitalism of a third world character. And when Mrs. Thatcher in the House of Commons announced that the first McDonald's hamburger joint had opened in Moscow, as if this was the proof that democracy had finally arrived, I think that was a slight exaggeration. And what we are seeing there, of course, is the return of nationalism, is the disintegration of the Soviet Union, is an authoritarianism. And in Eastern Europe now, fascism and anti-Semitism are coming back. After all, you can well understand, if you live in East Germany and you've got between 30 and 50% unemployment, you're bound to say, why should the Turks have jobs? Why should the Yugoslavs have jobs? Why should the Jews have jobs? We want the jobs. And don't ever forget, it was mass unemployment that brought Hitler to power. So the situation is just a little bit different. My own opinion is that the excitement in the West about the changes in the Soviet Union are not about the outcrop of liberal democracy, but about three things. First of all, the belief that socialist ideas have been extinguished. Secondly, that the military threat has been extinguished. But thirdly, and most importantly, that in Eastern Europe is a very highly qualified workforce with very low wages that can be colonized by Western capital very profitably for themselves. And I think that explains an awful lot of what we are reading at the moment. Now, if I turn from that to the Middle East, which has been the subject of a lot of comment and still is, here you have a part of the world producing a lot of oil upon which the United States and Britain, until we discovered oil in the North Sea, was entirely dependent. And in the 1950s, when Mossadegh, the first non-corrupt Iranian leader, came to power and booted the British out of Abadan, the Americans, that and at the time of Suez a year or two later, American power filled the vacuum left by the withdrawal of British power. And Turkey has been consistently supported because Turkey was the main bulwark against the Soviet Union. And one of the great reasons, of course, for the betrayal of the Kurds was that after the First World War, when the Turkish Empire broke up, we promised the Kurds, of 26 million people, they'd have a nation of their own. By 1922, at the Treaty of Sèvres, it was clear that Turkey, the remains of Turkey, was a bulwark against the new communist Russia, and therefore the Kurds were betrayed by the West then. When the Turks invaded Cyprus in 1974, which was an act of aggression quite as serious in legal terms as the Kuwaiti invasion, then of course the Americans supported the Turks, because Turkey was the bulwark against the Soviet Union. And of course, as you could imagine, from all empires, because we were one and know what it's like, the way empires work is to prop up dictators locally who then keep their own people down, in return for which you give them military support for that, and they then deliver the raw materials to you. That's how we ran India, with the Maharajas and the Rajas and all that, and that's how the sheikhs have delivered the goods for the United States. And the Palestinian case was rejected, though something might possibly emerge at Madrid. And of course, the United States supported Saddam Hussein. I mean, he was seen as a local dictator. And undoubtedly, one of the things he must think about as he sits in his ruined bunker is, what is it that I did that lost me the friendship of the United States? I dare say Noriega has the same feeling. They were both creatures of American policy at the time when they were useful. And when the Khomeini, do you remember the Khomeini was the great danger man a few years ago at the time of the hostage crisis, when Jimmy Carter was sweating it out, hoping they'd come back before the inauguration of President Reagan. It was, of course, Iraq that was relied upon to try to undermine Iran by the Iran-Iraq war. Now, if I sound as if I'm saying critical things about the United States, you're right, but British hypocrisy in this passes almost all belief. Iraq was run by Britain for years. In the 1920s, when Britain ran Iraq, there was an uprising in Iraq, and Britain used mustard gas against Iraqi tribesmen in the 1920s. We're the ones who talk about chemical weapons. Then in 1958, which is not so very long ago, at least not in my book, in 1958, the British Foreign Secretary, and we remember, carved out Kuwait from Iraq because we wanted the oil protected. The British Foreign Secretary wrote to John Foster Dulles and said, the British government are thinking of turning Kuwait into a British colony. What do you think about it? Oh, said Foster Dulles, what a very good idea. That was a British occupation of Kuwait treated in that way. And I think myself that the Gulf War was not about what it was supposed to be about, democracy and human rights and all the rest. It was about the reassertion of American power in an area of the world where an enormously valuable resource, namely oil, was to be found. And that was the reason for the attack on Iraq, because Iraq had got too powerful. It cannot have been any interest in Washington in democracy, because the one thing that's absolutely clear is that if there was any democracy in Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia would be in exile himself. Or any democracy in Kuwait, because if there had been any democracy in Kuwait, the Sheikh of Kuwait would not be about anymore. And so you got this war presented as if it was a UN war. It wasn't a UN war at all. And since the beginning of this very year, 200,000 Iraqis have been killed by Western or coalition bombing, and according to the Harvard medical team that went there not long ago, 170,000 Iraqi children under 5 are going to die, if they haven't already died, in the next 12 months because we bombed the water supply, and cholera and dysentery are now sweeping off the children of Iraq. And Saddam Hussein is still there. And that doesn't surprise me, because if Washington could work with him before, I'm sure they could work with him again. Now, this is the background against which we're supposed to take this tremendously optimistic view of the world in which we live. If I look at the third world, and I see the role of the international bankers, the IMF, in squeezing their budgetary policies in order to extract the interest from the debt crisis, if I see the rising population, the growing poverty, and the problems that confront them, and the fact that dictators are still supported from the West, and the fact that they have been bankrupted very often by their own arms budgets, they're persuaded to buy arms to keep their own people down, and then told they've got to pay the interest on the arms they bought for that purpose, I think myself it's not a very pleasing prospect. I won't say much about the future of Europe, except that there is now an opportunity, without any doubt, for a wider Europe, which does include East and West, but not, I think, on the basis of the Treaty of Rome. So it is against that background that I re-examine, as a socialist, the future there may be for socialist ideas. And perhaps I may say to this audience, which you may already know, but I find talking in America, as I do quite regularly, there are many people who don't know what an enormously important socialist tradition there is in the United States itself. There was, of course, Robert Owen, the first man to be called a socialist, an industrialist, came to New Harmony, Indiana, and set up his cooperative there, and my wife went to visit it the other day. There was Eugene Debs, a fabulous man who stood as a socialist candidate for the United States presidency in 1919. He had a slight disadvantage as a candidate. He was in prison for sedition at the time. And I've got one of Eugene Debs's campaign buttons at home, which I pride as a picture of Debs in prison uniform behind bars, and it says, "For President of the United States, vote for federal convict 9543. And he got 1 million votes. Now that's quite an achievement. And if you look at the Wobblies, if you look at the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the anti-intervention movement, in my book, and I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, I think there are so many socialists in closets in the United States. You've either got to build more closets or somebody's got to come out and say what has to be said. because there is an eternal search for justice and peace, right from the time of the Spartacist revolt, which Kirk Douglas played so vigorously in that old movie, right through the whole of human history. And of course the trade union movement, an integral part of the struggle for human rights, because without the trade union movement there was no power strong enough to stand against the power of capital. When Debs was engaged, because he was a railwayman, in the famous strike against the Pullman Company, Pullman said, if necessary, I shall hire half the working class to kill the other half. That was the crudity of 19th century capitalism, and it was certainly true in Britain as well. And what I think we have to examine, if we're looking at the world we live in, at least from an academic point of view, if you don't want to take it further, is what was and what is the socialist critique of capitalism. Now, Karl Marx has been having a hard time recently, and it's perhaps necessary to point out that he died long before the Russian Revolution. He wasn't responsible for anything that happened. He's no more guilty of what happened in Russia than Jesus Christ was for the Inquisition, which happened sometime later too. Marx sat in the British Museum and studied British capitalism. He analysed it, and he came out with some quite interesting ideas. One was, I put it very modestly as I'm in Iowa, that there is a marginal difference of economic interest between those who sweat their guts out creating the wealth and those who happen to own it, sometimes known as the class struggle, but I don't hardly like mentioning it, that there is solidarity, a natural interest, common interest between working people, not only in every country, in each country, but in every country, and that was the basis of his idea of internationalism. And there is a school of thought to which I think I probably adhere, that Karl Marx, who was a Jew, was the last of the Old Testament prophets. He was somebody who came along and identified the basis of the injustice of Victorian capitalism, which was very, very harsh, and I might add, was not the liberal capitalism we talked about, because working class men did not have the vote in 19th century Britain, in Dickensian Britain, and women, of course, didn't have the vote until 1918. And if you look at the contradiction between enormous wealth and enormous poverty and the waste of resources of unemployed people who could create the wealth in order to raise living standards, you realize there is a very powerful critique, a socialist critique of capitalism that has at least to be confronted and faced. Because it isn't very easy for me in my own district to explain why there are building workers out of work who could build houses and homeless people who can't get homes to live in. Now that is an absolutely basic example, or why there is overproduction of food and people still dying of starvation. And I think also you have to recognize, therefore, there is no necessary connection between capitalism and political democracy. Apartheid was capitalist. It's never called that because it would be too embarrassing to call it that. But it is a capitalist system, apartheid. It just happened that the blacks who did the work didn't have the vote as well, and it was based on color. But there is no necessary connection between capitalism and democracy, and I might add, as we've learned in Russia, no necessary connection between communism and democracy. Democracy is something that is a challenge to all authoritarian power systems. And when, therefore, I look at the world in the light of this, and I notice the United States has 2,000 bases abroad, you've got 130 of them in Britain. 2,000 American bases abroad. They aren't there to protect democracy and human rights. They're there, like all empires, to protect American economic and political interests. And I say this with some feeling, coming from an empire that has now disappeared. And you can see exactly what it is really about, and that's why the arguments about the New World Order being based on the Gulf victory don't make much sense. If, therefore, you were to look and see what is really happening and what really has to be done about it, I think you have to go back to the technical changes of this century. Because in 1900, the fastest moving vehicle was a railroad train that went at about 60 miles an hour, now the spacecraft at 25,000 miles an hour. In 1900 there was the primitive calculating machine, or the abacus, Now there are the microcomputers that will do billions of calculations a microsecond. In 1900, the largest form of communication was somebody with a megaphone addressing a crowd, perhaps bigger than this. Now, with the modern communication, you can address the whole population of the world. And in 1900, the most powerful killing machine was a Maxim machine gun. Now you have the hydrogen bomb. And all of these technical changes have produced tremendous accretions of power. And the question is, who is to control the power? That is what the New World Order must be about, or it's about nothing at all. And if we are going to look and see whether this power is to be used to create jobs and homes and good health and education and dignity for old people and democracy and human rights, then we come to institutional questions. And I am a great believer that democracy is a process. How you use it, how people use it, is for them to decide. But at the core of it, it is a process. And there has to be some proper institution at the global level. I cannot believe for a moment that what happened in the Gulf War, where Perez de Cuellar was really totally inadequate in the role that he played, and the American pressure was brought to bear, so the Russians got a subsidy from Saudi Arabia and the French got a loan from Saudi Arabia, and the Chinese were told they'd be forgiven Tiananmen Square if they didn't veto the war, and so on. Cannot believe that had anything to do with the founders of the United Nations. I came back in 1945 as a pilot from the war, and the first meeting of the United Nations General Assembly was held in London, about half a mile from, well, quarter of a mile from the House of Commons, and it reflected in its organization the aspirations of the human race for peace, not for some authorization for an expression of military power by one nation. And if we are to look at the UN, it must be authorized to deal with planetary protection, and that includes environmental questions, chemical and nuclear weapons and pollution. Must have a role in human rights, even if they occur in Northern Ireland, where the British systematically deny human rights. Must have some UN forces that are not under the control of somebody appointed by the Pentagon. There must be direct elections to some assembly with the power to override the superpower veto, i.e., the elementary developments of democracy in our societies, yours and mine, which were about a growth of popular control over executive power, has got to be reproduced on a global level. And you've got to deal with this question of the debt and the control of the multinationals. For my sins, I've spent a lot of my time dealing with multinational companies. I remember Henry Ford coming into my office once when I was Minister of Technology, and he floated in like an emperor visiting a ward, and virtually told me what he expected me to do. And dealing with Shell and Esso, because I was the energy minister for many years, you have to remember that these multinational companies are in many cases much bigger than nation states. They have huge resources, and they have no loyalty to any country, not even the country of their origin, and they try to dictate what they want. And you can't have a political system that doesn't take account of economic and industrial power. And then you've got to carry this down right to the local level, the national government, the regional government, and so on. But at the root of it all, it seems to me, because the Christian socialist input is what I must tell you has greatly influenced me, you have to decide what life is about. Are we a community, or are we a sort of regulated jungle? And until you've decided that question, you can't make sense of anything. And whoever is in power, if you haven't settled that question, whether you're about cooperation or competition, whether you're about profits or whether you're about people, doesn't seem to me you can make sense of your national policies or indeed your international policy. I had a very old friend, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was had a difficult chair at the Union Theological Seminary. He was the professor of applied theology, which I thought was quite a difficult chair to occupy. But he said something which I have never forgotten. He said, man's capacity for evil makes democracy necessary, and man's capacity for good makes democracy possible. And I must tell you, what I think we're witnessing now is not the death of communism. I mean, everybody knows that's over, but an enormous attack upon democracy by those who hold economic and military and media power. That is what I think is happening. And in the course of my life, I have developed 5 democratic questions which I offer you, because I formulated them as I had the opportunity of meeting a lot of very powerful people. And these are the 5 questions that I offer you as the litmus paper of democracy. If you meet a powerful person, might be Brezhnev, might be Henry Ford, might be Saddam Hussein, might be anybody, ask them 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Now, that last question is the democratic question. And if you can't answer the question, how can you get rid of me, then you've no right to exercise power over anybody else. Now, I personally have come to the conclusion many years ago that it's democracy that frightens people. I don't think socialist rhetoric frightens anybody. Anyone can make a socialist speech. I've made a few thousand in my life. It's a bit like a bishop's sermon. So long as you talk about brotherhood on a Sunday and nothing happens till next Sunday, the people in power aren't frightened. But when you start challenging their power, what authority have you got to do that to me? Then I tell you, you're really in trouble, whether you're dealing with capitalism, communism, apartheid, or indeed sometimes historically religious leaders as well. And what I am afraid of in the West is that we have created a form